What if the one place you worked so hard to make your sanctuary, your escape from noise, stress, and other people's rules, suddenly turned into the center of a war you never asked for? What if a power-hungry HOA president looked at your private property and decided it belonged to her, no matter what the deed said? One day, your family's safe haven is yours. The next, it's filled with strangers, decorations, and the sound of your own neighbors treating your home like a public stage. A forged contract, a smear campaign, a community manipulated into believing you're the problem. And in the middle of it all, one truth you can't ignore. This isn't about rules or dues. It's about power, control, and what happens when someone thinks they can take what isn't theirs. Let me start from beginning. When I bought that house, I wasn't just buying walls, windows, and a roof. I was buying a fresh start. After a rough personal loss, I needed something steady, something that felt like mine. The place was quiet, tucked into a neighborhood where the grass was always trimmed the same height, and the mailboxes all looked like they came from the same catalog. To me, that sameness meant stability. I thought the HOA's strict rules would protect that peace, not take it away. I pictured weekends where I could work on small construction projects in the garage, or evenings on the porch, just watching the world slow down again. That house wasn't just property. It was supposed to be a sanctuary where I could rebuild a life piece by piece. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors kept to themselves, polite nods across driveways, the occasional wave. And then she showed up, Brenda, the HOA president. She had that practiced smile, the kind that was wide but didn't reach her eyes, and a clipboard tucked under her arm like it was an extension of her body. She introduced herself with warmth, complimented the landscaping, said how glad they were to have a responsible homeowner moving in. I wanted to believe her. She talked about community events and how my home had the perfect layout for gatherings. At first, I brushed it off as small talk, but then she leaned in with a request. Would I be open to hosting an HOA fundraiser? Just one evening, she said. A harmless community thing. I was polite but firm. I had just moved in, still unpacking boxes, still finding my footing. The idea of strangers filling my space, my sanctuary, didn't sit right. I thanked her for the thought, but said no. She smiled again, but this time it was tighter. Her eyes flicked toward the house, scanning it like she was already measuring where she'd put the decorations. Of course, she said. I understand. But something in her tone told me she didn't. A week later, I went out of town for a short work trip. It wasn't even long, just 2 days. When I came back, the sight that greeted me stopped me cold. My driveway was packed with cars I didn't recognize. Music thumped faintly from inside my home. And when I pushed open my front door, my stomach dropped. My sanctuary, my private refuge, wasn't mine anymore. Caterers bustled around the kitchen, trays of hors d'oeuvres balanced on their arms. Streamers hung from the walls I had only just painted. Strangers laughed in my living room, their shoes grinding dirt into the carpet. It wasn't just a party. It was a full-blown event, and it was happening inside my house. I felt sick. This wasn't a neighborly mistake. This was a takeover. When I demanded answers, Brenda swept in like a queen entering her throne room. She held up a packet of papers, what she claimed was a rental agreement. My name was at the bottom, scrawled in a signature that looked close enough to mine to fool someone glancing fast. She said I had agreed weeks ago, that this was all approved. My protests were met with smirks and shrugs, as if I was the one being unreasonable. I wasn't just humiliated, I was violated. My home, the one place I thought I was safe, had been turned into a stage for Brenda's power play. But if she thought I was just going to roll over, she was wrong. I might have been new, but I wasn't naive. The moment the last guest cleared out, I got to work. Every security camera angle, every motion alert on my phone, I saved it all. I pulled up emails where Brenda had asked me, in her cheery tone, if I'd consider hosting an event. Emails where I had politely but clearly declined. The forgery on that contract? That was just the start. I knew from the first glance it wasn't my handwriting, and I had the legal experience to back up that claim. I bought a thick binder, one of those heavy-duty ones with reinforced edges. Each page I added felt like armor, screenshots, letters, timestamps. I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was building a shield. Brenda thought she was laying a paper trail to trap me, But in reality, she was leaving fingerprints on every single one of her lies. The more I dug, the more obvious it became. This wasn't about me personally. This was about control. My house was just her newest trophy, and I had stepped into a game she'd been playing for years. Only this time, she'd underestimated the opponent. By the end of that first week, the binder was already thick. And as I flipped through its pages, one thought kept me steady. If Brenda wanted a war, she was about to get one. The pressure didn't just come from Brenda anymore, it came from the whole HOA machine. Overnight, notices piled up in the mailbox like junk mail, each one stamped with bold red letters claiming violations that didn't exist. Unauthorized use of amenities. Failure to comply with community standards. The list went on, each one carrying a threat of mounting fines. And while most people might have panicked or lashed out, I just kept filing them neatly into a binder. Every single sheet was another brick in the wall Brenda was building around herself. But the real sting wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the whispers. You could feel it when you walked down the street. Neighbors pausing conversations when you got close, side glances at the grocery store, muffled words like selfish and unstable. Brenda was good at painting pictures, and the one she'd painted of me was a man who thought he was too good to follow the rules, someone who believed he was above the community, and the sad part, people bought it. At least for a while. The HOA doubled down with flyers slipped under doors. They called me bitter, antisocial, unwilling to cooperate. They even claimed I had once agreed verbally to share my property, a lie so bold it almost made me laugh. Almost. Because behind the theatrics, behind the fake smiles and legal jargon, I knew what Brenda was really after. Control. My land wasn't about value, it was about power. And she wanted to prove that no one in the neighborhood was untouchable. But instead of exploding in anger or slamming fists on tables, I decided to move differently. Brenda was loud, but I could be patient. While she paraded around with clipboards and flyers, I built my case quietly, piece by piece. I pulled metadata from the so-called forged contract, showing it had been created weeks after the date stamped on it. I had security camera logs that proved no such agreement was ever made. And then there were witnesses, neighbors who'd been intimidated by Brenda before, finally willing to share their side of the story. The more I gathered, the calmer I became. Each night, while the house was quiet and the neighborhood slept, I'd sit at my desk and sort the evidence into folders. I even backed everything up twice, one on an external drive, another in the cloud. If Brenda wanted a fight, I'd give her one. Not with shouting or screaming, but with the one weapon she never thought I'd use. The truth. So when word spread that the HOA was throwing a community victory party at my property, yes, my property, I knew the moment had come. Flyers announced it like it was already theirs. Pool party celebration hosted by the HOA. I couldn't believe the audacity. Brenda walked around like a queen, smiling as she handed out invitations, basking in the applause of people who thought she had pulled off the win of the century. The morning of the so-called party, I watched from my window as neighbors arrived in swimsuits, carrying coolers, towels, even inflatable pool toys. The kids were excited, the parents curious, and Brenda, well, she looked like she was floating on air. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched high, she strutted through the crowd, giving orders as if the property had been hers all along. But beneath the calm surface, I had already set the trap. My cameras were rolling, my documents neatly stacked in a folder. Backup power hummed quietly, ensuring nothing could be accidentally erased or lost. I had everything I needed, not just to stop the party, but to expose the scam. When the gates opened, the neighbors expected laughter, music, the sparkle of water in the sun. Instead, what they got was silence. No music, no pool chairs. And when they looked inside, expecting a shimmering blue pool waiting for them, they froze. The pool was there, yes, but the atmosphere wasn't one of celebration. It was one of reckoning. Brenda tried to push the energy, clapping her hands, insisting it was time to enjoy what we've all worked so hard for. But whispers spread through the crowd as people noticed the cameras mounted around the property. Then I stepped forward, calm, collected, holding the folder that carried weeks of preparation. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to scream. I simply opened the folder and laid it out, proof after proof, piece after piece. The forged contract, shown with metadata that exposed its fake date. The security footage showing no such agreement was ever made. The testimonies from neighbors who had been pushed, fined, or lied to in the same way. And the kicker? Evidence that the HOA had planned the entire victory party as a show of dominance, not a celebration. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back now stared at Brenda in shock. Phones came out, recording everything, capturing her expression as her carefully built story crumbled in front of her. Brenda tried to spin it. She always did. She claimed I had doctored the files, manipulated the footage. But the more she talked, the more desperate she sounded. And by then it was too late. The spell had broken. The party Brenda promised turned into a public humiliation. The neighbors didn't celebrate, they questioned. They didn't cheer, they demanded answers. And for the first time, Brenda didn't have any. By the end of the day, the HOA's credibility was in tatters. What was meant to be her shining moment had become her downfall. And as the crowd slowly dispersed, muttering and shaking their heads, I realized something simple but powerful. Sometimes the best payback isn't about shouting the loudest or hitting the hardest. It's about standing your ground, keeping your calm, and letting the truth do the work for you. And on that day, the truth was louder than anything Brenda could ever say. For weeks, I had been preparing for this moment. The HOA's intimidation tactics had escalated beyond flyers, threats, and fake fines. They had sent imposters dressed as officers, forged documents, and tried to paint me as the villain in my own neighborhood. But the truth has a way of breaking through, and it came crashing down the night the real authorities finally stepped in. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the tension like a knife. Officer Morrison, a seasoned cop with a sharp eye for nonsense, stepped out of his cruiser and immediately sensed something was off. The imposters, who had strutted around my property just minutes earlier, suddenly looked like kids caught sneaking out past curfew. Their uniforms were mismatched, their radios silent props, and the badges clipped to their chests were nothing more than shiny trinkets bought online. Morrison didn't waste time. He asked each of them for their credentials, running through routine verification questions only trained officers could answer. Within minutes, their story collapsed. They stuttered, contradicted one another, and finally, one admitted he was just a relative of Brenda, the HOA president, roped into helping enforce community safety. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered stood in stunned silence. For months, many had believed Brenda's word as gospel. They nodded along when she claimed the HOA had special authority. They had even whispered about me behind closed doors, convinced I was just being stubborn or defiant. Now they were watching the very people they trusted unravel in real time. Brenda, never one to back down, grew more desperate. She waved her clipboard, shouting that I had signed agreements and owed back dues, that my property was part of the collective. Morrison calmly asked her to produce originals of the documents. All she could hand over were flimsy photocopies riddled with inconsistencies. The so-called contracts had forged signatures, mismatched dates, and even my name spelled wrong in one section. It didn't take a lawyer to see through it. It took one sharp cop and a room full of witnesses. As Morrison continued peeling back the layers, the charges began stacking. Impersonating law enforcement, forgery, harassment, fraud, and then, the most chilling, attempted sabotage. One of the imposters admitted Brenda had encouraged them to stage incidents on my property, anything that would make me look dangerous or unstable. That, Morrison explained to the growing crowd, wasn't just neighborhood drama. It was a federal crime. He got on the radio, looping in detectives and alerting higher authorities that this had crossed into something much bigger. The mood of the neighbors shifted instantly. People who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Brenda now looked horrified. Some muttered apologies under their breath. Others shook their heads, realizing they had been manipulated for months, maybe even years. The whispers started. She lied to all of us. I trusted her. She fined me for no reason. The illusion of Brenda's power cracked in real time. and there was no patching it back together. Brenda, however, refused to let go of her grip. She doubled down, claiming the authorities were corrupt, that the whole neighborhood was under siege, that she was the only one protecting them from dangerous outsiders. But her voice, once commanding, now sounded hollow. The louder she shouted, the clearer it became that her empire had been built on intimidation, not truth. The fallout came swiftly. Morrison placed the imposters in handcuffs, their cheap uniforms wrinkled and pathetic under the glow of real police lights. Brenda was handed a notice of investigation, her clipboard trembling in her hand as she realized her so-called authority was slipping away for good. Within days, lawsuits stacked up. Fraud, harassment, conspiracy, impersonation. The list read like a crime drama script. But this was real life. Neighbors who had once mocked me came to my door, sheepish and ashamed. Some apologized directly, admitting they had been too afraid to challenge Brenda. Others offered to testify, finally free from the grip of her threats. The community, once fractured and hostile, began to heal in the wake of her downfall. But even as justice rolled forward, there was one reminder that battles like these don't always end neatly. A week later, I received an anonymous letter in my mailbox. No return address, just a single line scrawled in sharp ink. You think it's over? But the HOA isn't done with you. I held it in my hands, the weight of it pressing heavier than any clipboard or phony fine Brenda had ever thrown at me. Because here's the truth. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought overseas or in a courtroom. Sometimes they're fought right outside your front door, where power, lies, and control collide with the simple act of standing your ground.